It's the late 1930s in New York, and a Jewish man is sitting on the subway reading a Yiddish newspaper. And after a few minutes, the man lifts up his head, and on the other side of the subway, he sees one of his Jewish friends reading Der Stürmer, the Nazi newspaper. And the man immediately gets up and he marches towards his friend and he says, "What are you doing? How can you possibly be reading that Nazi rag? You're Jewish." To which the friend responds, "How can you possibly be reading that Yiddish newspaper? What does it tell you? In America, the Jews are assimilating. In Palestine, the Arabs are rioting and killing Jews. In Germany, Jews are being stripped of their rights. In my newspaper, Jews run the banks, Jews control the government, Jews are running the world." That joke is about the state of the Jewish people nearly a century ago. But unfortunately, it still feels exactly as if it's speaking to us today. As we all know far too well, hate, and specifically hatred for Jews, is pervasive and growing in this country. In 2022, the Anti-Defamation League tabulated 3,697 anti-Semitic incidents throughout the United States. That's a 36% increase from the number of incidents recorded in 2021, and it's the highest number on record since the ADL began tracking anti-Semitic incidents in 1979. And that number's only going up. Just last month, the ADL reported that over the summer, 26 synagogues in 12 different states were harassed by individuals calling in fake bomb threats in a trend called swatting. And in an even more disturbing trend, the ADL's 2023 report on anti-Semitic attitudes in America concluded that 20% of Americans believe at least 6 anti-Semitic tropes to be true. That means that 1 in 5 Americans believes that Jews run the banks, and that Jews control the media, and that a secret Jewish cabal is running the world. In his recent book on the state of hatred in the United States, which has the terrifying title, "It Could Happen Here: Why America is Tipping from Hate to the Unthinkable," Jonathan Greenblatt, the president and CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, writes about the fact that when he assumed his position in 2015, he had a recurring nightmare. He dreamt that his phone would wake him up early in the morning and an ADL staff member on the other end would convey the terrible news that there had been a horrific massacre at a Jewish site in Europe, a mass shooting at the Great Synagogue in Rome, a bombing at the Jewish Community Center in Berlin, an attack on a kosher supermarket in Paris. And that call did indeed come. There was a horrific attack at a synagogue 3 years into Jonathan Greenblatt's tenure as the head of the ADL, but it wasn't in Rome, it wasn't in Berlin, it wasn't in Paris. It was right here in the United States at the Tree of Life Synagogue in the historic Jewish neighborhood of Squirrel Hill in Pittsburgh. The day following that infamous attack in October of 2018, Jonathan Greenblatt traveled to Pittsburgh, and here is what he writes in his book about his visit on that day. "As I stood in front of the Tree of Life, I wondered if our European experience presaged a dark future for America's Jews. Would we too have to fortify our schools, our markets, our houses of worship? Would we have to retreat from public institutions and shared spaces because of hate? Would we feel vulnerable, exposed, and marginalized in our own land to the point where we would be forced to contemplate exile and a better future elsewhere?" Those are very scary and very real questions. And I am deeply sorry to report that as we approach the 5th anniversary of the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue, those questions have only become more relevant, more pressing, more top of mind for all of us. We recently adopted a practice here at Temple Beth Shalom where once a month on a Shabbat morning, a member of our security committee makes a series of announcements at the beginning of the Torah service, reminding the congregation where the emergency exits are and what security measures need to be taken in the event of an attack. I'm profoundly grateful to our security committee for making those announcements, but at the same time, I am profoundly disturbed by the fact that those announcements need to be made in the first place. And yet, despite how scary it is to be a Jew in the United States in the year 2023, this year, I felt a glimmer of hope. As many of you know, this past year, anti-Semitism had a bit of a moment in popular culture. Two of the most successful plays on Broadway, Leopoldstadt and Parade, both dealt with the very difficult topic of anti-Semitism in the most public and prominent forum. Leopoldstadt, the play by the great playwright Tom Stoppard, follows 3 generations of a Jewish family in Vienna throughout the first half of the 20th century as they contend with assimilation, with anti-Semitism, and ultimately with the Holocaust. There are 31 cast members in Leopoldstadt, and the play opens in the year 1899 with a very full stage, but by the time the play concludes, 2 hours and 10 minutes later, in the year 1955, 10 years after the liberation of Auschwitz, there are only 3 family members remaining. The cast has been whittled down from 31 to 3. It's a brilliant, powerful, and striking visual tactic to drive home just how devastating the Shoah truly was. But what was even more powerful was a speech given by one of the family members at the beginning of the play in the year 1899. Here's what he says. 50 years ago, Jews couldn't travel without a permit or get a bed for the night in a village or a town except in the Jewish quarter. My grandfather wore a kaftan. My father went to the opera, but I have the singers to dinner, actors, writers, musicians. This is the promised land. We are Austrians now. And yet, as he delivers that speech, everyone in the audience knows exactly what's coming for the Jews of Austria. The not-so-subtle subtext of Leopoldstadt is that while nominally it may be a play about the Jews of Austria in the 20th century, really, it's a play about the Jews of the United States in the 21st century. It could happen here. And the other major play about anti-Semitism this year, Parade, the play about Leo Frank, reminds us that it did happen here. In 1913, Mary Fagan, a 13-year-old girl working in a pencil factory in Georgia, was raped and murdered. And suspicion fell upon Leo Frank, the Jewish manager of the factory where Mary Fagan worked. Leo Frank was arrested, he was tried, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to death on the basis of the thinnest of circumstantial evidence. His real crime, of course, being the fact that he was Jewish. But from the moment his death sentence was announced, the defense began to appeal the verdict. They made the argument that public opinion and anti-Semitism had swayed the jury and that there was not sufficient evidence to condemn Leo Frank to death. And miraculously, the governor of Georgia, John Slayton, listened to the defense. On June 21st, 1915, he commuted Leo Frank's sentence from death to life in prison. But less than 2 months later, an anti-Semitic mob, calling themselves the Knights of Mary Fagan, attacked the prison where Leo Frank was being held. They kidnapped him, and they lynched him. And the wrongful conviction and lynching of Leo Frank over 100 years ago was a wake-up call to American Jewry. It was that incident that led directly to the creation of the Anti-Defamation League. And in 2023, as anti-Semitic incidents are skyrocketing, the Leo Frank case is once again a major topic of discussion among American Jews. Prior to the curtain going up each night, the cast of Parade recited Mourner's Kaddish for Leo Frank. And I imagine that every Jew in the theater shed a tear, as I did, when Ben Platt, who played Leo Frank on stage, sang the Shema as he was lynched by the mob, echoing the moment when Rabbi Akiva recited the Shema as he was killed by the Romans thousands of years ago. When the writers of both Leopoldstadt and Parade wrote their plays, they were channeling the words of the most famous playwright, of course, William Shakespeare. When Shakespeare wrote Shylock's speech in The Merchant of Venice, he has Shylock say, "I am a Jew. Has not a Jew eyes? Has not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die?" As difficult and depressing as things are for American Jewry, I want to take a moment to acknowledge and celebrate the fact that two of the most important and successful plays on Broadway this past year spotlighted anti-Semitism. And those plays both swept the Tony Awards. Leopoldstadt won Best Play, Parade won Best Musical Revival, and they both won numerous awards for acting and directing. This year, two plays about anti-Semitism collectively won 6 Tony Awards. That is no small accomplishment. In her new book called We Need to Talk About Anti-Semitism, Rabbi Diana Fursko writes about the fact that for most of our lives, the majority of American Jews really haven't given all that much thought to anti-Semitism. As she writes in her book, we enjoyed the luxury of historical and geographical distance from the realities of hate. We went to the Holocaust Museum. We weren't in the museum. We watched Schindler's List. We weren't on Schindler's List. We may have even happily believed that anti-Semitism was over, gone, done, a relic of a time long past. But over the past 5 to 7 years, all of that has drastically, radically changed. Anti-Semitism has transitioned from the background to the foreground. 10 years ago, many of us believed that the history of anti-Semitism had already been written, that the book was closed, that all of this pernicious hatred was behind us. But today, we finally understand just how naive we truly were. So what are we supposed to do? How do we handle this new reality that we are all struggling mightily to come to terms with? Well, in the words of Rabbi Diana Fursko, we need to talk about anti-Semitism. We need to talk about what it is. We need to talk about where it came from. We need to talk about why it is so dangerous not only to Jews, but to the world at large. And most importantly and pressingly, we need to talk about how to fight anti-Semitism. The best strategy for fighting anti-Semitism comes from the ADL itself. It's what they call the 3 S's. Speak up, share facts, show strength. This morning I want to focus only on the first of those 3 S's. Speak up. Whenever you see anti-Semitism, you have an obligation to stand up and speak out. We can no longer afford to remain silent. At the office, that could mean speaking up in the boardroom if someone makes a Jewish joke. At school, it could mean reporting an anti-Semitic remark to a teacher or a parent. On social media, it could mean reporting or flagging someone's anti-Semitic post on Facebook or Instagram. And admittedly, speaking up in the face of anti-Semitism can be a very difficult and very uncomfortable thing to do, but there are strategies that can be used. If someone accuses a Jew of being greedy, for example, you can ask a clarifying question like, are you referring to one Jewish person that you know? Or are you painting an entire group of millions of people with a single brush? Or you can explain the impact of the anti-Semitic remark by saying something like, comments like that reinforce a very dangerous and harmful anti-Semitic trope. Whatever tactic you use, the most important thing that you can do to fight hatred and anti-Semitism is to stand up and speak out. That's precisely what the writers and producers of Leopoldstadt and Parade were doing when they chose to put on those two particular plays this year, at this moment in Jewish history. It was their form of standing up and speaking out against the scourge of anti-Semitism. And that's why it was so imperative for me to see both of these plays this past summer. The truth is, I'm really not much of a theater person. I'll move mountains to go see Bruce Springsteen or the Rolling Stones, but I generally don't run to see Broadway shows. But knowing that these two plays with such powerful messages about anti-Semitism were playing to sold-out crowds every night made me feel that I, as a rabbi, couldn't afford to miss them. And I'm so grateful that I was able to see them both. I know it's the wrong holiday, but I've been thinking a great deal about Purim and Queen Esther over the past year. In Hebrew, Esther's name means hidden, which is exactly how she keeps her Jewish identity during the first part of the Purim story. But things change for Esther in chapter 4 of the Megillah when it becomes clear that Haman is planning to wipe out the Jews of Persia. So with the fate of the Jewish people in the balance, Esther has to make a choice. She can either stand up and speak out, or she can remain silent and save herself while condemning her fellow Jews to death in the process. And it is at that precarious moment in the story, when Esther is wrestling with what she should do, that Mordecai sends her a message. He says to her, "Who knows, Esther, maybe you have come into your royal position for just such a moment as this. Maybe it is your destiny to speak up and save the Jewish people," which of course is precisely what she does. Today, the year 2023, this is the moment that Esther prepared us for. Swastikas are being scrawled in bathroom stalls in public schools in Milburn and Livingston. Molotov cocktails are being thrown at synagogues in Bloomfield, right here in Essex County. Now is the time to use our voices. As we are taught in Pirkei Avot, the great compendium of rabbinic wisdom, B'makom she'ein anashim hishtadel hiyot ish. In a place where there are no people, no one standing up, be that person who stands up and uses their voice. Because as Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel taught, indifference to evil is more insidious than evil itself. It's more universal, more contagious, more dangerous. Do not be indifferent to evil. Stand up, speak out. If you were to ask me what the essence of our tradition is, what the single most important Jewish teaching is, I would tell you it is not ve'ahavta l're'echa kamocha, the mitzvah to love your neighbor as yourself, as Rabbi Akiva taught. It's not the idea that every human being is created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God, as Shimon ben Azai taught. It's not even the obligation to observe Shabbat, or to keep kosher, or to study Torah. Of course, all those things are important. But for me, the most fundamental pillar of our tradition is lo tuchal lehitalem. You shall not and you cannot remain indifferent. When you see the suffering of others, you have an obligation to do everything in your power to alleviate that suffering. And if that's true when you see the suffering of other people, then how much the more so is it true when we see the suffering of our own people? Last month, we commemorated the March on Washington, the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington. And on that day, 60 years ago, August 28, 1963, over 200,000 people converged upon the National Mall in Washington, D.C., to hear Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. lay out his vision, his dream for a better future for our country. But the person who spoke immediately before Dr. King was Rabbi Joachim Prinz. Rabbi Prinz, a refugee from Germany, was not only the rabbi of Temple B'nai Abraham, but he was also the president of the American Jewish Congress. And here's what he said on that illustrious day in one of the most memorable and important speeches in the history of American Judaism. When I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned under those tragic circumstances was that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. A great people, which had created a great civilization, had become a nation of silent onlookers. They remained silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality, in the face of mass murder. America must not become a nation of onlookers. America must not remain silent. It must speak up and act, from the president down to the humblest of us all, for the sake of the image, the idea, and the aspiration of America itself. May Rabbi Prince's words come to pass speedily in our days. And to paraphrase Mordechai in the Megillah, who knows, maybe we have been put in our position for just such a time as this. Shana Tova.